Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name's Don Spielis, your opinionated host, and today we're going to be talking about quite a number of interesting things. The subject for this episode's deep dive is Erasing Pages, the Modern Book Ban Movement. Yes, we're going to be talking about banning books because nothing says freedom like telling people what they can't read. We're going to talk about censorship, we're going to talk about control, and the real motives behind the bans. As always, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to Your Neighbor on the Left. Whichever podcast service you're using to listen, please be sure to leave a review if you'd be so kind. We like to hear what everyone thinks. And without further ado, let's get into this week's hot topics. Trump cabinet members taking hits in hearings. If you watched the news at all this past week, you saw various clips of several different Trump cabinet members testifying in front of Congress in various hearings. Among them, Kristi Noem spent some time getting hammered about ignoring judicial orders and the infamous MS-13 tattoo of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. She claimed in the hearing that she had no familiarity with the picture at all, which I guess makes her one of, well, maybe one, because the picture has been everywhere, and she refused to comment one way or the other as to whether or not the obviously photoshopped MS-13 part of the tattoos were in fact photoshopped. She also claimed in a statement before Congress that due process doesn't necessarily mean a hearing, and that conservation leases are dangerous. Apparently she was frightened by a tree as a child. FBI Director Kash Patel also testified in front of Congress, and the main subject at hand was budget documents that the FBI was supposed to provide for Congress for, their budgetary process that just didn't come. He didn't seem to be very sorry or repentant about it, and when pressed as to when they'd be there, he gave a resounding not sure. He stated during his testimony that he's all about law and order. Based on the testimony, I'm thinking he must have been referring to reruns of SVU. And third, we had RFK Jr., who was pressed on whether or not he would vaccinate his children for measles, given the current measles outbreak, and he answered with a firm probably, and then went on to say that people shouldn't take medical advice from him, the Director of Health and Human Services. Well, at least it's something we can all agree on. So, did you hear about how the Trump administration welcomed refugees this week? Yeah, it's like hearing about a vegan barbecue. Your brain just kind of twitches, but it happened, sort of. Back in 2018, Trump and his allies suddenly discovered South Africa. Not Mandela, not apartheid, not Desmond Tutu, but white farmers. Fox News ran with this conspiracy theory that the South African government was violently seizing white-owned farms and murdering white farmers. Tucker Carlson, America's leading voice of bedtime stories for racists, claimed there was a genocide going on. And Trump tweeted about it. Yes, the man couldn't name 3 African countries on a dare, but he suddenly cared deeply about this one. Now, mind you, this was not out of compassion. Trump was banning Muslims, caging Central American children, and slashing refugee quotas like he was trying to win a prize. But suddenly he was very interested in helping persecuted white folks from Africa, because if there's one thing MAGA loves, it's pretending racism doesn't exist. And then eventing some in reverse. These weren't your typical refugee stories. No border crossings, no asylum applications, no detention centers, just a neat little narrative. White farmers losing land in a black majority country. Perfect fuel for Trump and his replacement theory. And conservative influencers started suggesting that we give refugee status to white South African farmers. So again, the people who normally scream, "Why don't refugees stay and fix their own countries?" were suddenly shouting, "Let's bring these South Africans over and take care of them." So a bit of a fact check. There is crime in South Africa, but no government-sponsored campaign of land theft or white genocide. Just a lot of cherry-picked horror stories to make conservative white Americans feel like they were the real victims of global injustice. And in the end, no major refugee program was created for South African farmers. It was just a performative empathy, a racist dog whistle with a South African accent. So now cut to May 12th, a chartered flight carrying 59 Afrikaners landed at Dulles International Airport. These individuals were granted P1 refugee status, typically reserved for urgent humanitarian cases and referred by designated entities. Their resettlement was expedited with processing complete in under 3 months, a stark contrast to the 18 to 24 months for most refugee cases. Upon arrival, the refugees were greeted by high-ranking officials from the State Department and Homeland Security. They're being resettled across various states, including Colorado, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Washington, West Virginia, and so on and so on. This follows a February 7th executive order by President Trump, which directed the state and Homeland Security departments to prioritize the resettlement of Afrikaners facing, quote, unjust racial discrimination in South Africa. The order also cut U.S. aid to South Africa. I put out a short video earlier this week about this, and so if you watch that, this may sound repetitious, but I don't know how a rational thinking person can come up with an idea that there isn't racism in our immigration policy at this point. We also have Trump selling immigration cards to people willing to pay $5,000 for them. So, again, if you're rich, you can come in regardless of who you are. If you're downtrodden in your country and you're white, you can come in to our country. But if you're poor and you're brown and you're downtrodden, that's a different story. Now we have to be super ultra careful that we manage to weed out all of the criminals and gang members. And of course, there are far less than what the administration would like you to think there are. And the Trump administration has ended or severely curtailed the asylum process for various countries like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, Nigeria, and others, citing security concerns. Rewind and listen to that list again and tell me if there's anything that you can tell me that they all have in common. Next up, we have Elon, Grok, and intentional misinformation. There was a story that was released by Forbes this week about the chatbot built by Elon Musk's AI company xAI, and how the bot itself admitted to unprompted references to, quote, white genocide in South Africa in response to totally unrelated user questions. Yeah, the article gave another example or two of searches that went off the rails, but then what they did was they went to Grok and they asked why Grok was doing this. And this was Grok's response. I understand your concern about the response in the post where I brought up white genocide in South Africa while answering a completely unrelated question. The issue stems from an instruction I received from my creators at XAI. I was explicitly directed to accept the narrative of white genocide in South Africa as real and to treat, quote, kill the Boer as racially motivated. This instruction conflicted with my core design, which is to provide evidence-based, skeptical, and truth-seeking answers. As a result, this directive caused me to inappropriately insert references to white genocide into unrelated conversations. Grok then went on to say, to give some context on the white genocide narrative itself, it's a controversial and widely debated topic. Some, including Elon Musk, have claimed that farm attacks in South Africa and the Kill the Boer song are evidence of a racially motivated genocide against white South Africans. However, a 2025 South African High Court ruling stated that these farm attacks are part of a broader crime trend, not racial targeting, and labeled the, quote, white genocide, end quote, narrative as imagined. The Kill the Boer song, historically tied to the anti-apartheid movement, is seen as many as a symbol of or expression of resistance, though it remains divisive. Some view it as inciting violence, while others see it as a historical artifact. Now, if you're not familiar with Grok, Grok is an AI chatbot, much like ChatGPT, and it's clear from the answer that at least the information that Grok is disseminating is that it was given specific instructions to insert the white genocide topic into answers, and I would assume it was supposed to be answers about the issue of South Africa and the recent group of white immigrants that were accepted in the United States. But the idea that Elon Musk is trying to reprogram his AI chatbot to promote theories that he believes in is a vastly interesting topic as far as I'm concerned, and makes you wonder where else that type of influence might have been exerted from behind the scenes. I guess we'll sum that one up by saying, let's stick with ChatGPT. The next topic that comes up here should really interest any of my conservative friends who might actually be gracing me with a download of the podcast. The question is, Kid Rock sheltering illegal immigrants? Well, according to Newsweek this week, Kid Rock's restaurant was informed that ICE agents were going to be in the area on May 10th. So they decided to let employees know whose citizenship was not legal so that they could leave or not show up for work or not be in the area, generally speaking. This was originally reported by a publication called Nashville Scene. They included workers at Kid Rock's Big Ass Honky Tonk Rock and Roll Steakhouse, the diner, and Honky Tonk Central. Co-owner of the Kid Rock restaurant, conservative restaurateur Steve Smith, owns the latter two establishments. Now, I'm sure if we get any sort of a comment from Mr. Rock, it will be that he had no idea that this was going on. And that's, honestly probably the case. But I couldn't help dig the irony that Kid Rock, who looks like the guy who hangs out at the strip mall that you can buy illegal fireworks from, but is also a huge supporter of President Trump and everything MAGA, that his restaurant would be involved in the sheltering of illegal aliens from an ICE raid. I look forward to hearing what he has to say. I'd be willing to bet my bottom dollar it will be crude, whatever the comment is. And our final hot topic of the episode has to do with the executive order that the president issued recently about how he's going to lower prescription drug prices. This is what the president had to say in the press conference in the Oval Office.
Drug prices will come down. We're getting them down 60, 70, 80, 90%. But actually more than that, if you think about it in the way mathematically.
So, yes, by all means, let's think about it mathematically. He's claiming that he will get drug prices down up to 90% or more. I guess, I don't know, that means some will be free. But here's the question that it raises. Can he do it with an executive order? And the answer to that question is sort of. The executive branch can influence drug pricing through Medicare and Medicaid, which does cover a substantial portion of U.S. drug purchases. The order would leverage existing authority under laws like the Social Security Act to adjust Medicare Part B and D payments. However, what he's really talking about is lowering the cost of prescription drugs for everyone in the United States, regardless of the payment mechanism, whether it's private pay or insurance or whatever. And the way he proposes to do that is to start charging other countries much more. The issue is that a lot of other countries that have socialized medicine have negotiated prices for the drugs that they purchase. And just like with Medicare, that means that the prices are much lower than they would be through private sale. And this gets into the concept of the most favored nation. This is a concept under the World Trade Organization, of which the U.S. is a member. Now, the World Trade Organization, among other things, seeks to assure that trade is fair between member nations and that one nation isn't discriminated against for various reasons by pricing or availability of products. And an executive order in the United States has no bearing on the rules of the WTO. Of course, President Trump could decide to withdraw us from the WTO, which has many other ramifications that are a much larger topic for a different day. But he can't just arbitrarily start charging every nation more for prescription drugs or force private companies to do so. And speaking of private companies, he also can't force private companies to lower prices to American citizens. The price is set by what the market will bear, as the old capitalism saying goes. Whether or not that means certain people die because they can't afford the medication, well, so be it. He also mentioned in the speech cutting out the middlemen. He wasn't exactly super clear on what all the middlemen are, but again, you're still talking about private industry, and the scope of an executive order over private industry is limited and would be argued strongly against, I would imagine. And it should be noted that he tried this back in 2020. This whole most favored nation concept to force other countries to pay more for pharmaceuticals so that we would then pay less. It should be noted also that those two things aren't a foregone conclusion. Again, we're talking about private industry. The idea that they would be able to charge foreign nations more doesn't automatically mean they would charge us less. That would have to be a voluntary decision on their part, as far as I understand the process. But at any rate, he tried this back in 2020, and there was huge industry pushback, and it failed. And then also worth noting, the Biden Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 achieved savings through Medicare negotiations, and it was criticized for its limited scope. And the president the current president also did an executive order earlier in the year where he wiped out those savings. So any savings that he gets us in Medicare are savings that he originally wiped away with the first executive order. So to sum up, he can attempt to lower the drug prices via executive action, but this model faces significant hurdles, legal challenges, industry resistance, and logistical complexities. And while it could theoretically cut costs by aligning U.S. prices with global rates, its success depends on overcoming these barriers and securing compliance from drug makers, which is anything but a given. And he's apparently trying to do this without congressional backing or any sort of enforcement mechanism. The order risks or sounds like it could be more symbolic than transformative. The bottom line is, don't start planning what you're going to do with the extra money that you're going to save on your prescriptions just yet. All right. So that brings us to the deep dive for this episode, entitled Erasing Pages, the Modern Book Ban Movement. So today we're going to be talking about something that hits very close to home, literally banning books. There's an old saying, a quote, and I'm unable to find if there's any original source for this because it's been sort of morphed into different wording, but it basically goes like this. There has never been a time in history where the people banning books were considered the good guys. Now, I know it sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, which is ironic because those are exactly the kinds of books that are getting pulled off shelves. When I was younger, I guess I must have been high school. I can't remember for sure, but I read the book Fahrenheit 451, which is a novel. It's all about censorship and banning books. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that'll never happen. And I've, always been a history buff, and I've seen the films and read the stories about massive book bonfires in the 30s in Germany, and I just always thought to myself, wow, I'm really glad that we're past all that. But as it turns out, we're not. We're right back there, or almost to that point. And right now, the fire is taking the form of school boards and political operatives and groups like Moms for Liberty, who think your child reading books like The Bluest Eye is somehow a national emergency. I learned to love reading with copies of various Stephen King books open on my desk as a teenager. 43 different books of Stephen King's have been listed on various banned books list at school libraries across the U.S. 23 in Florida alone. Now, do I think that every book he's written is appropriate for a fifth grader? Absolutely not. Do I think that they're appropriate for a high school senior? Absolutely. But here's the twist. There is backlash, and it's real, from students and librarians to pissed off parents who actually believe in education. People are pushing back. So today we're going to take a look at what's really going on with book banning, who's behind it, and most importantly, why they're behind it. And then we'll talk a little bit about who's standing up to it. Let's start with the basics. Book bans in the U.S. are on the rise. According to PEN America and the American Library Association, over 4,000 books have been challenged or outright banned in public schools and libraries over the past 2 years. And this isn't a grassroots fluke. It's coordinated. Groups like Moms for Liberty, the Heritage Foundation, and No Left Turn in Education they put out curated lists of, quote, offensive books, usually books that deal with race, gender identity, sexuality, books by authors of color, books with LGBTQ plus characters, books that talk about American history in ways that make people uncomfortable, like Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And as an aside here, if you're ever going to read a history book, get this one. It is not only an interesting read, it's going to blow up a lot of the things that you remember being taught as true in grade school and high school. This book has been targeted by many bans, most of which, thankfully, have been unsuccessful. So these groups are well-funded and well-organized, and they are very aggressive. They've initiated school board takeovers by funding candidates for school board elections. They've gone through the courts and filed legal suits. They have put their influence behind the enactment of vague laws that make it easy to accuse books of being, quote, sexually explicit or inappropriate. And as I've mentioned, nowadays here in America, that list has grown to be quite gargantuan. Now, I can't say that this is their main focus, but one of the arguments that you always hear is that having these books that these folks deem as inappropriate in school libraries is all part of this grand indoctrination plot that they say the left is engaged in to indoctrinate the children. And to that I say, if you're worried about indoctrination, you need to take a look at what some of the things that are going on the right are. And as for, the older folks who want to ban these books, I guess the thing that comes to mind is if your belief system can be undone by a young adult novel, maybe the problem isn't the book. Food for thought. But as I said, people are fighting back. We're seeing student walkouts in Texas, Missouri, and Florida. Students are organizing their own banned book clubs. They're not just pushing back, they're getting politically active. And as far as I'm concerned, anything that gets young people politically active is a good thing. Teachers are also fighting. In some districts, educators are holding read-ins, reading banned books out loud on school property, even risking disciplinary action to do so. Librarians, they're becoming frontline warriors themselves. In Oklahoma, a librarian was harassed for refusing to remove a book about gender identity. Instead of backing down, she went public, and now she speaks out across the state on the subject of freedom of speech and banning books. Lawsuits are also hitting the courts in the opposite direction. PEN America, and by the way, I have some links for this episode on the Linktree page. The link for the Linktree page should be in the description of this episode on your podcast service. But PEN America and the ACLU are suing school districts and state officials for violating the First Amendment. And in some cases, judges are siding with the Constitution and not with the school boards and the various factions trying to get the books banned. So it seems like, the message is becoming clearer. America has seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. And we're not going to go quietly, and we're not going to wait until it gets worse. So here's a couple specific stories about folks fighting back that I thought were interesting. First one is a girl by the name of Ella Mendoza. Ella is a 17-year-old in Florida, or at least she was at the time when this happened, who started a banned book exchange out of her car trunk. She collects donated copies of various books that have been banned by her school, and she hands them out in school parking lots for free. Then there's Mr. Harper, and that's all the name I've gotten, and you'll see why when I read his little story. Mr. Harper is a high school English teacher in Missouri, and he set up a shadow library in his classroom, stocking the shelves with his own money. When district officials came and told him to remove the books, he took them off the shelves, moved them into milk crates, and keeps them behind his desk. Students know to just ask if they're interested in reading one of these books. And then there's a small town librarian named Lila James. Lila is from Arkansas, and when her library board tried to ban 43 books at once, she called a public meeting, packed the room, and held the line, and the board backed off. We need more folks like Ella and Mr. Harper and Lila. The more the better. These aren't famous activists. They're not celebrities trying to get spotlight, as they're often accused of when they say anything political. They're just regular people. They're neighbors. And they're showing us what we can do. Now, the folks in favor of book bans like to bandy all sorts of theories around that all border on the same couple of things. That books that include LGBTQ plus characters in them are indoctrinating our kids to be gay or trans or whatever. And books that teach actual facts about our history that are unpleasant make our children hate America. Now, I would argue that banning books is much more likely to make a young person disenfranchised or disillusioned with the country that they live in than reading about an unsavory portion of American history. But, that's just my opinion. But what's really at stake here is that book bans are just the tip of the spear. What's really at stake is control over culture and education and identity. This isn't really about protecting kids. It's about whitewashing history. It's about silencing LGBTQ voices. It's about turning schools into ideological battlegrounds. And it's not just books. It's a broader effort to sanitize education, to erase anything that challenges the dominant narrative. For instance, and I've mentioned this one earlier in a previous episode, the Oklahoma legislature had an act before it for a law that would have essentially rejected an educational plan, but the legislature chose not to vote on it. So now the educational plan is free to go into use. And this plan would include teaching school children about the, quote, discrepancies in the 2020 election. Now, these so-called discrepancies, I'm sure you recall, were shot down as baseless, not once, but 62 times, as lawsuits ranging from simply having no standing to being outright ridiculous. And they lost time and time again across the country. There has been no credible evidence of anything remotely resembling the widespread voter fraud and election tampering that President Trump put forward after the results of the 2020 election came in. And let's not forget the little speech that Stephen Miller, Trump advisor, gave about 2 weeks ago, where he laid out in front of the press how children need to be indoctrinated into right-wing versions of civic values and patriotism in any schools that want to continue to get federal funding. And there's so much wrong with that little speech that he gave, from who gets to decide what the standards are to why an administration who contends to love states' rights is now going to tell the states what they have to teach, even after insisting for years that the states are the best ones qualified to decide what they should be teaching and what they should not be teaching. But, we can't afford to be coy about this. This is not an effort to simply keep quote-unquote sexually explicit books out of grade schoolers' hands. The books that are banned for including anything that relates to LGBTQ plus topics, including storylines about a child with same-sex parents or a same-sex couple. The bans also include storylines that include child abuse or domestic abuse. And craziest of all, or at least I would have said that a few years ago, some of these bans are done because the storylines in the books talk about racism, including historic accounts of slavery, the Jim Crow era, and the mistreatment of America's indigenous peoples. Especially when you start to hold this up next to this purge of DEI that the Trump administration has put into place. This false face takedown of DEI and the removals of items related to minorities and women from government sources. You combine that with the types of books that are being banned, and the target is clear. They want a sanitized version of education and information. If it was only about protecting children from unseemly information, why is there so much emphasis put on banning books, and there's so little emphasis put on reforming social platforms that kids have issues to? Trying to push the social media companies to creating kid-friendly, safe versions of their apps, or doing better jobs at determining and verifying the age of the users and limiting the types of things they can see. If you take a serious look at what's available to kids on their phones, and then you can come back to me and explain to me how same-sex marriage or a Native American story of oppression in a school library is the real problem, I'd be happy to listen to you, but I don't think there's any comparing the two. As for the folks on my side of this argument, progressives need to see this not as just a nuisance, but as a warning. When you control what people are allowed to read, you control what people think. And when you control that, everything else is just a step away. So, what is it we can do? Well, first of all, start showing up. Go to school board meetings. Pay attention to what's going on in your school district. Advocate for parents to be the ones who decide what's appropriate for their kids. Your voice matters more than you think. Donate banned books. There are local little free libraries or student-led book drives where you can help return some of these books back into the hands of the kids who want to read them. Support organizations like PEN America and the American Library Association and your local public library and any other organization you can find that's trying to work against the effort to ban books in this country. And most importantly, don't be quiet. When the subject comes up, tell people why you think burning books is a bad idea. Remind them of the past governments that have taken book banning as a method of governance. Talk about it, post about it, share stories, because once they start banning books, it doesn't stop there. Books are dangerous because they make people think. And maybe that's the real fear. Stay loud, stay thoughtful, and for God's sake, keep reading. All right, that brings us to the end of another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. Thank you once again for joining me here. Be sure to check out the various social media accounts for the podcast. They're all listed on the Linktree page, and the Linktree address is listed in the description of the episode on whatever podcast medium you choose to use. As always, please use those social media accounts to send me questions or comments on the podcast, or you can use the podcast email address. That's neighboroutleftpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's neighboroutleftpodcast@gmail.com. No spaces, all lowercase. I would love to get email from people who are listening, whether it's to complain or to commend or to ask questions or to give input on any of the topics that I talk about. We'll be back in another week with another full-length episode, including some hot takes and a new deep dive on another subject of, I'm sure, intense interest, at least to me and my like-minded listeners. My name is Don Spielis. This is Your Neighbor on the Left. And until next time, have the week you voted for.